It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Kusha Navidar. I'm filling in for Brian today. So just a few weeks ago, the United States hit a big milestone birthday. But instead of celebrating the last 250 years, a lot of us spent the day worrying, and maybe some of us asked one question in particular: how much longer can this last? Our next guest says, longer than you think. His new book tells 8 stories from the 1790s through the 1890s, and I'll give you a teaser of some of these historical stories. Hyperpartisan newspapers run by the founders themselves, a senator beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor, and a New York newspaper war that gave us the phrase fake news. That's just a few stories to name. He also teaches at Utah Valley University, where Charlie Kirk was assassinated last September while this book was still being written. Joining us now is Greg Jackson, creator, host, and head writer of the popular U.S. history podcast, History That Doesn't Suck, professor in constitutional studies and national security studies at Utah Valley University, and the author of the new book, Been There, Done That: How Our History Shows What We Can Overcome. Professor Jackson, welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much, Kusha. Happy to be with you.
Happy to have you. So you say that you hear it everywhere you go. It's never been worse. I'm wondering, why are so many of us convinced that right now is the nadir of our democracy?
Well, first, I'll say that that's a theme I noticed in doing my research, is that we have a tendency to catastrophize the present. And I don't say that to dismiss the very real issues that we're facing, but this is a part of our human nature. The blank page ahead of us is terrifying. Whereas when we read history, we can even take something like the Battle of Antietam, literally the bloodiest day in American history, over 20,000 casualties during the Civil War. And yet when we read that, no one's really wondering, does the nation survive? You know what comes on the next page. That kind of numbs us in a way to really empathizing with our predecessors and recognizing, holy crap, that had to be the most terrifying day pretty much ever.
So you're saying it's the blank page that really frightens us because we don't know what's going to happen next.
Yep, that's what's scary.
Your book makes the case that, hard times have happened before. We can survive hard times now. It makes that case with 8 stories, and they all come from before 1900. You say that history should be a source of strength for us. How badly did Americans behave back then, and why does that make you optimistic about our present day?
It makes me optimistic because I see that Americans behaved as badly then as they do today. So if you think of this almost like data, right? We've got 250 years of data. Now, the Constitution didn't kick in 250 years ago, but let's embrace the date, run with it. 250 years of the American experiment, and we have had violence. We have had absolute games played with our institutions, with the electoral process, and yet we've not only managed to survive these moments, we've so overcome them that we aren't remembering them. I'm having to dig these stories up that have become forgotten. Some stories that shocked me with the level of violence and corruption that just don't make the highlight reels today. And so if we can overcome those moments, I feel that not only does that say, okay, our institutions are strong enough to endure the worst of us. And let's keep in mind that the founders were thinking of that. Federalist 51, what does James Madison say? If all men are angels, we wouldn't really need government, right? To paraphrase him. Or as I like to say, people suck. They understood that, and they built institutions designed to take that beating. So all that to say, if we've been able to endure the past, I believe we can endure the present. And more than that, that these past instances that do rhyme with our present give us lessons on how we overcome these moments.
It's so interesting to think of the Federalist Papers and Madison just writing at the top, people suck, so let's make them all as small and separate as possible.
It's important to translate, what feels like lost jargon into present day parlance.
For sure. I'm right there with you. Listeners, what makes you feel like right now is the worst it's ever been in American politics? Tell us the specific thing. Maybe it's something you saw in the news this week. Maybe it's an argument at your own dinner table. Maybe it's something you're afraid of for your kids in in the future, like we were talking about, that blank page. Our guest is a historian who has spent years telling people that Americans have been here before. So bring him your worry and let him take a swing at it. And if you think that's a little too easy, that our problems really are new and a history lesson lets us off the hook, we want to hear from you too. Give us a call, send us a text. We're at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. So, when I was going through getting ready for this segment, one thing popped into my head, and I just saw a text come through as well. So that's why I want to bring it up before we dive deeper into the book. The text reads, "We've never had social media, AI, and the internet before. That to me is the greatest difference between past survivals and today's fear of survival." So, Greg, I'm sure you have thought about that so much while writing this book. How hard is it to compare today to the past?
Well, that's where I'm paraphrasing Mark Twain. It's rhyming. It's not an absolute repeat, right? So we've gone through major technological revolutions that have absolutely changed public communication. And you're actually walking us right into chapter 8. So something I didn't really think about before this book, until I was studying yellow journalism from this specific lens, was the way that technological changes opened the door. The disruptions that came with the second industrial revolution kicked open the door to the sensationalism that yellow journalism brought. You go back to earlier years, you've got a hand-cranked press, this newspaper, and news travels slowly. You've got an elite that's reading it. So even as I do open the book with an example of fake news from Benjamin Franklin, this is an era of long, winding essays meant for the elites. Well, what happens when suddenly you've got telegrams and electric cables and trains, and now information to them, this feels like an increase in the speed of information moving, the same way that we are feeling with AI, with even the internet in the last few decades.
Yeah, it was exponential. It was unlike anything they had seen before.
Precisely. And so, yes, this is faster than ever. I'm not dismissing that whatsoever. But in terms of that, of feeling those G-forces of technology changing, and then having people who step in and go, wow, what can I do with this? Whoa, yellow is a color that can now be printed. I can do incredible, outrageous illustrations, and no one's going to think to question whether or not that illustration is really accurate. Well, okay, that's kind of like an AI-generated image. It's just happens that it's Newsies pressing that in your face, left, right, and center. The morning edition, the afternoon edition, the evening edition, the special edition, all day getting inundated with it.
I love that Twain line that you used about the past and the present rhyming, not repeating. I think that's a really good framework to think about. I also want to dive into civility, because I think that's a lot of text that I'm seeing come through here, and that's one that people really mourn. There's a real sense that we used to disagree like gentlemen, and somewhere along the way we stopped. And I think even that term gentleman is like normative in a certain way for what the past used to be, but that's a different segment for a different time. But your first chapter says that that's a myth, that we used to disagree like gentlemen. So tell us about Jefferson, Hamilton, and their newspapers.
Yeah. Here's the headline. We ended up with two national newspapers. The very first, there weren't any truly national newspapers in the colonial era. But in the very first years of the Washington administration, we ended up with two national newspapers. They absolutely went for each other's throats. They threw insults. And one effectively was the Federalist supporting newspaper, and the other was the Jeffersonian Republican newspaper. The insults were absolutely fantastic. Some of my favorites are aristocratic junto, moneyed aristocracy, stock jobbers, audacious scribblers. I try to work that into conversations now. So first of all, we are just down in the gutter, period, right? We're just lobbing insults, like calling someone an idiot in print. But we're also happy to misrepresent one another's views. So you've got James Madison writing on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, attacking Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton answers in kind. And one of my favorite quotes, Kusha, and all of this is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison writing about Alexander Hamilton. He tells him to select some of Hamilton's most damning heresies, and I'm quoting this here, cut him to pieces in the face of the public.
Yeah, that's aggressive.
So I'm sorry, where's the gentleman in here?
Right. Right.
And by the way, that is exactly what James Madison then attempted to do, but he was up against Hamilton, so that didn't work out.
We got a text about this specifically saying name calling has been the thing that they feel has really demoralized the country. Listeners, if you have something that you feel like it's the worst it's ever been in American politics, tell us the specific thing. Or maybe it's something you saw in the news this week. Maybe it's an argument at your dinner table. Our guest is a historian who has spent years telling people that Americans have been here before. So bring him your worry. Maybe we can talk about why history might rhyme even if it doesn't repeat. Give us a call or send us a text, 212-433-9692. That's 212-433-WNYC. There was another example, Greg, that brought me back to learning about U.S. history in high school, which was when disagreements turned physical. And I'm thinking of Charles Sumner, which was a deep cut for me. It's talking about how politics aren't safe anymore. Take us to the Senate floor in May of 1856. What happened to Charles Sumner?
Yeah, May of 1856. First of all, let's just piggyback a little bit on that gentlemanly disagreeing. Now, I want to start by saying I'm a big fan of Charles Sumner and his abolitionist agenda. But the speech that lit off Preston Brooks, he wasn't just saying that slavery's bad. Charles Sumner took to the floor and said that Senator Andrew Butler had courted slavery, that it was his harlot, basically that he's bedding whores. And in the 19th century context, that's a deep insult. He also made a comment about how Andrew Butler couldn't even speak for himself effectively. And it was everyone in the room understood it. What he was doing is he was making fun of Andrew Butler's half paralyzed face due to his stroke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, everyone knew what was going on. And let's also add this layer. He's not really speaking to the Senate. He knows that everything he says is going to be loved by his fellow abolitionists. It's going to be loathed by the majority in the room, especially the Democrats. And he's really preparing mailers, right? He's going to mail out his speech. It's going to be reported in the news. Basically, he's preparing his viral tweet. That's what the speech is about. So he gives it. Preston Brooks is absolutely livid. And of course, I go into all sorts of details to set up the very different worlds these two people come from, where Preston Brooks understands violence in the Southern Honor Code. This isn't to excuse this absolutely disgusting act of violence, but I really like to try and help readers understand where figures are coming from. That doesn't condone where they're coming from, but understanding that's what makes history interesting. So from Preston Brooks' perspective, Charles Sumner, this Northerner, is not worthy of being asked to duel, though he considers it. He's a lesser who should be beaten. And he walks up to Charles Sumner while he's seated in the Senate chamber itself in the Capitol. This is a day before legislators had their own offices. He announces to Sumner that he has libeled his state of South Carolina. He's libeled his cousin, Senator Andrew Butler. And basically, I'm here to answer for that. Pulls out his cane and cracks it on the senator's head and just keeps going. Yeah. Charles Sumner loses his sight for a moment. Like he blacks out. He manages to rip the desk that's bolted to the floor up and trying to escape. But the whole time he's trying to move, Preston Brooks is cracking him over and over and over. Blood is gushing. He's knocking over furniture. Preston Brooks later describes Charles Sumner. He's bragging about this. He writes that toward the end, he bellowed like a calf.
Wow.
And when others try to intercede, his fellow, these are all members of Congress. Let's again keep that in mind. His fellow legislators take to the floor, his friends from his state, South Carolina, intercede, hold up their own canes, threatening other senators. Keats yells at Crittenden, "You let him alone, God damn you." That is, again, a quote from the records. And the cane finally snaps. Preston Brooks keeps hitting him with a shattered cane until he just bleeds out effectively on the Senate floor. He barely survives, and it takes him years to recover. And
so yeah, sorry, wrap it up there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So what happens to Preston Brooks? Yeah. There's basically a show of disapproval from the opposing party. His party supports him. He resigns from Congress to say, how gracious he is, and he's reelected to his seat for the next term with a 30% increase in support.
Wow, that is bananas. Like, that's the only word that I can think of, that to have violence met with that kind of
approval. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to bring in a caller now. We've got Julie in Hastings, New York, who I think has some perspective on the past and how it compares to the future. Julie, hi, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for taking my call. Yeah, I'm a historian, and I agree with the historian that some of the events in the past were as bad, if not worse, than today. I mean, I think of the systematic attacks on Native Americans and slavery, and yeah, the caning of Terrell Sumner. And actually, what's been worrying me is that our situation today, what is becoming polarized and with demagogic aspects on one side, a little like the 1850s.
So let me put that into a question here. Do you see that there is the 1850s polarization showing up now, Greg?
Our polarization's bad, yeah. And look, Kusha, one thing that I fear is sometimes lost on those who haven't read the book in whole, and I'm not accusing that by any means from this wonderful caller, is that I'm somehow giving a Pollyanna, hey, everything's fine, guys. No, what I'm saying is I want an urgency that meets reality, not a panicked feeling at the wheel. Imagine a car's fishtailing, right? The worst thing you can do is freak out and start overcorrecting. Let's acknowledge where we're at, and this partisanship is bad. It absolutely is. This is on par with some of the hyper-partisanship of our past, and that's exactly why I think it's important for us to look to the past and see where they did it wrong. How do we better control the effects of partisanship, to again use James Madison's own words, and make that course correction without having to flip the car into an absolute spin out.
I see. And Julie, thank you so much for calling in and for offering that parallel so we could kind of tease it out. Since we're talking about things that might be different now, I also thought about climate change quite a bit, Greg, when I was reading, and I want to bring in a text here. It says, great guest, I worry the climate crisis truly does make our moment unique. America has faced existential crises before, but it was in an age of climate stability we're leaving behind. I worry the massive scale of this challenge is something human civilizations haven't successfully navigated before, and there's no indication we're going to be able to in this moment. What do you make of that?
That's a wonderful and fair question. I'll first of all note that it's not within the scope of the very three specific lenses that I went with. Right? I looked at political violence, I looked at contested elections, and I looked at fake news / biased news. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm really prepared to speak in detail to the effects of climate change as well. But I will note, just generally as a historian, that again, not trying to be Pollyannish, but we have had moments where we thought we wouldn't be able to feed the population, and then the agricultural revolution came along. So that to say, oh, don't sweat it, right? That's my constant concern that people will mistakenly read.
Right.
But we do have a pattern of focusing on what looks like insurmountable problems, and then scientifically or otherwise, coming up with new technologies, coming up with things that do turn the corner. But none of that says don't focus on it. We should be thinking about this issue.
Right. I hear what you're saying is don't stick one's head in the sand. Take up and look around and see what the past can teach you about the future, which is kind of like a historian's job, is what you're saying, is learn from the past. Is that fair?
Yes. And Kusha, I'll add this. My biggest fear is cynicism. That is what I think, whether we could say cynicism even about the climate as well, to return to that question. If we just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, whatever, so let's not worry about it because we're toast anyway, that is the worst thing we can do, right?
Yeah.
And that is what I see and fear with our republic. If there's anything that dooms us, it's
cynicism.
Convincing ourselves it's never been worse, there's nothing we can do, so let's throw our hands up in the air and not sweat it.
I hear that. Let's go to Christine in Hawthorne, New Jersey. Hi, Christine. What's on your mind?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for taking my call. So I love this glass is half full I love it. This is how I look at the world. The glass is always half full. The difference right now, as I see it, is we have a federal government led by a president who is behaving much like the segregationists, the states in the 1960s. And he is using his power to constrain our citizens, rip away First Amendment rights. I am a community organizer. I am appalled by his attacks on the press. And it's the first time in history that we have seen a president behave this way. And he has immense power, immense power. Congress has abdicated their power. So while I love this idea of that it's been bad, certainly it's been bad, but we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble because
thank you so much. I appreciate that call. What I hear you saying is that this, and Greg, I'd love to get your take on it, is that the way, especially that the president's behaving, it reminds Christine, at least, of segregationist behavior. And the first time the president has behaved this way, I think I heard that as well. Greg, what's your take on that?
Yes, and thank you, Christine. First, and I don't mean this cavalierly, but yes, we've said that to ourselves many times before, going all the way back to, say, Andrew Jackson, who's referred to by his opponents as King Andrew for his monarchical seizure of power in the presidency. Where my mind actually goes, though, Kusha, is chapter 6 of my book, where I tell the story of an election for the executive office in which one candidate is told that he's lost. He refuses to back down. And we ultimately have a clash at the Capitol, a violent clash between his followers and the police. And there are dead left in the wake of it. And I am telling you about what happened in Louisiana in 1874. The contest was for the governor's office, and John McEnery, the Democratic candidate, refused the federal judge's decision in this very messy election filled with fraud and all sorts of things that did legitimately murky the waters, but refused to accept what was determined by a federal judge, that the Republican, William Pitt Kellogg, had won. And we ended up with about 30 people dead as police and state militia clashed with the militia that John McEnery claimed was his rightful state militia. We had two parallel governments running in the state at the same time. Again, rhymes, right?
Yeah.
This is not a repeat, but how fascinating that we've seen in the American experience such a level of contestation, of unwillingness to trust our processes. None of this is, again, to dismiss anything in the present, but it is to say we've had moments that we can look to that do inform how we think on the present.
We have a bunch more texts here that I'd love to read here. One says, I'm not concerned about behavior, I'm concerned about systems. I worry that the level of gerrymandering, judiciary capture, etc. that has already occurred means that we won't be able to repair our government for decades. And then we've got another one here that says, especially in the context of current level of income inequality, which I'm sure, Greg, is a theme that has happened in the stories that you tell multiple times, this idea of the haves and the have-nots. I mean, Twain himself wrote about that. To kind of take a step back and look at this from a systems level, because that text really resonated with me. You write that liberal democracy stops working when a faction believes that losing an election means the end of them. So like the election is the do or die moment, basically. And that mentality for you, that's your test for a real crisis. So with that in mind, where are we? Give us a report card if you could.
It's funny that you asked for a report card. I actually did a thing for Politico where they asked for a report card.
Media doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes, I guess. We could say that. I don't know. Sometimes just repeat. Sorry.
I love it. And I don't even know if I'll give the exact same answer I did then. I don't quite recall.
Oh, interesting.
But I remember debating in my head whether it was in the at best a B minus, but more likely in the C range. Yes, the existential crisis is the moment that things break. So the Civil War came because the Southern planting class, the slave power, to use the term, were convinced that the election of Abraham Lincoln, even as he is swearing up and down that he's not going to touch slavery where it then existed, that their way of life was about to be eradicated, and thus we ended up with civil war. I do not personally accept or see that we are at an existential crisis moment. Now, that again is not up to me individually. That is up to us, we the people. If one faction truly wants to go there, I just don't see us there yet. I believe we are still in a space for meaningful dialogue. And I very much hear the concerns about the present. And, right, that's not a but statement, it's an and. And that's why it's so important for us to be engaged. We have seen liberties pulled back. We've done this before. Reconstruction was an absolute failure, right? The era right after the Civil War. We have these beautiful amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that truly invited Black Americans into real citizenship, and then we allowed, and in fact, let me restate that. We the people chose. One thing that as I was working on this book, I became increasingly frustrated with the way we dismiss the death of Reconstruction as something that was kind of done in a DC back room. No, white Americans willingly allowed that to happen. In fact, we sent and encouraged politicians to give up on Reconstruction.
So I'm going to step in here for a second because we're wrapping up on time, but there was one more question that just inspired me based on what you were saying about we the people and how I think for your book, your answer to what we should do isn't a list of reforms. You call it public virtue. You push people toward the local, towards school boards, city councils, the planning commission. You sit on yourself. Yeah. So what does your history say to someone who feels like their vote disappears into the ocean?
I would say that my history shows, our history shows, that your vote doesn't disappear into the ocean, especially if you are engaged constantly. So one thing that I do want to make clear is when we show up in November, we are showing up to a decision that has largely been made. We're down to a binary choice. But if you are on your town's commissions, your committees, you're caucusing, you're in the primaries, and I would even say especially if you are, like me, you're a lousy partisan. You just suck at doing the blind loyalty thing. Be that voice within the system that breaks it up more and creates a larger tent. We're going to end up with better options in November rather than sending the Preston Brooks of the world back to Congress.
We have to leave it there for today. That was a wonderful last reference to Preston Brooks. Congrats on that. Congrats on this book. My guest has been Greg Jackson, creator, host, and head writer of the popular U.S. history podcast, History That Doesn't Suck, professor in constitutional studies and national security studies at Utah Valley University, and the author of the new book, Been There, Done That, How Our History Shows What We Can Overcome. As an optimist myself, I enjoyed this conversation and kicking the tires. So Professor Jackson, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.